Hello, students. This is Dr. Johnson. So, again, I just want a quick talk a little bit about qualitative research, which is what we're doing this week. So, again, the difference between qualitative and quantitative is that in qualitative research, you're not asking the why, right? You're not asking how much. So, it's mostly it's what, how, and why of a phenomena, right? It's not about how much of a phenomena. So it's more of words as opposed to numbers. So quantitative is quantifying. You're measuring, you're looking at numbers. Whereas with qualitative, it's more about feelings and stories and why things happen. So it's generally designed around social constructivism, right? Social constructivism, you're looking at about stories, you're collecting information about stories, and you're using the experience, you're looking at people experience, you're looking at languages, um, you're looking at uh, why and how of what things, why things happen. So researchers that usually use qualitative research will tell you it's, people think it's easier because, you're not really dealing with numbers and you're not really dealing with the tenets of quantitative research. But it's very tedious, it's a lot. It has a lot to do with you know, coding the data and as we go on, you're going to see that there are methods that aid to it. So, so it's social constructivism is that theory and knowledge um, about many aspects of the world around us, and and not real in themselves. It's more about um, social, teaches us about knowledge that develops as a result of social interaction. So that's what quantitative researchers want to get out of it. So if you look at some of the research that in nursing, it's mostly about how, about what, how, and why. So it's the research problem for qualitative research is different. The way it's based more on prior research experience, not the same as quantitative where you're asking closed-ended questions. The sample size are usually are small, and that's one of the attractiveness to it to some researchers, that you don't need to get, meet the sampling size to be able to become credible. So sample size can be as little as one, and it involves a lot of interviews and observation and archival data, and the interpretation of it is based on combination of the researcher themselves and the data that they've collected. So you will hear words like transcribing and coding and themes when it comes to qualitative research. Um, so it's non-numerical as opposed to your quantitative, and it goes beyond the information that quantitative research will find. And as we continue in the class, you'll see that you can actually combine the quantitative research with qualitative research. Okay, so there are different approaches to qualitative research. You have the biography, where that involves the study of one individual experiences, and it can be told to the researcher, right? It can be autobiographies, life histories, and oral histories. The role, so in qualitative research, you're actually looking at the role of the researcher more. So the role of the researcher in biography is to select the type of biographical study they want to do, and begin with objective experiences, um, noting the life course and stages and the experiences. They gather stories, they organize the stories around themes, and then explore the meaning of the stories, and then look to explain the meaning. With phenomenologic, phenomenology studies, they explore how people make meaning of their experiences. So it's based more on philosophical perspective of, these theories called the self, and it focuses on the intentionality of the consciousness. So the experiences that are coming from memory, from image, from meaning. And the researcher in phenomenology studies is more of a reduction. So they're getting this information and they're reducing it into things. They're analyzing specific statements. They're searching for all possible meaning, and they're setting aside prejudgments and biases. And then they're bracketing the researcher's experience as they're trying to narrow down that reduction to things. They have to understand the philosophical perspective of the approach that they will use, and they write the research question and explore what experiences mean to people, and ask people, individuals, that they started to describe everyday life experience. So it's more of life experiences, and the data they collect from people, like people who have experiences with issue of the phenomenon that is under investigation, they will analyze that data, and the data analysis for qual- qualitative research is tedious. So they will analyze it, and we're going to talk about, how they did, and then write reports to describe the essence of the experiences of their subjects, and of course the similarities in the meaning of those experiences. Another type is case study. Case study will explore a case or multiple of cases over time, and that involves detailed and in-depth data collection from multiple sources. It could be from a program, it could be from an event, it could be from activities, from individuals. And the case should be in the physical, it could be social, it could be historical, it could be economic setting. Um, the, the, they will consider the type of the case study that is most useful. The researchers will now select the case studies that show um, different experiences from different perspectives of the problem and the process and the events, and they will analyze the data. Um, they will do something called cross case analysis too. They will use within that case analysis, and of course they will report it. Let's talk about action research. Action research is another type of quantitative research that seeks full collaboration from all participants, right? So they often aim to change an organizational or institutional or community context. So the research will try to make a distinction between the participants and the researchers, right? So again, sometimes it's blurred, but they will try to distinguish that. So the researcher's role is actually to begin with a critical review of past actions and plan the next action using information that they gain from that review. They will engage in research to improve practice and to get on the understanding and change at the same time. They will engage in processing of regular systemic reflection and practice at every stage of the research, and they will try to maintain flexibility, and of course they will report the study. You have grounded theory, which is another important one. Grounded theory will generate the discovery of a theory that is closely related to the phenomenon that they're studying, and it will focus on individual interaction and take actions or engage in a process in response to a phenomenon. So again, these researchers, they will conduct field interviews, they will choose participants, they will collect and analyze their observations and their documents, and they will use systemic approach as they do it. So again, there are different ones. The ethnography will interpret culture. In this case, the researcher will actually mainly go into the culture and live with the culture as they try to analyze data, do data analysis and collection. Okay, and then you have participatory action research. This is more of like action research, where they will try to change some phenomenon in an institutional level. Okay, So there are different methods that you can use for qualitative. There are more, but these ones, participant narrative observation, they use that where they're now, observing their subject. Oh, before I do that, if you look at this slide, these numbers here are actually the number of participants that you can actually use. So in biography, it's just one. In phenomenology, sorry, I don't know why that word is so difficult to pronounce. You have 5 to 10. In grounded theory, you can have 20 to 30 plus. In ethnography of and case studies, as one or more cases, but the rest, depending on the institution or depending on the culture that you're trying to study. Okay, so like I said, methods, they use key informant interviewing. They may do field notes, in-depth interviewing. They will use journal logs, diaries, artifacts, focus group interviews, social networks, ethnography, where the culture-specific survey, spatial mapping, and all these things is just a way to collect data that they will now break into things and then use it to support their studies. So one of the things I want to talk more, because I know this is part of your discussion this week, is how do you know that qualitative research, that how do you trust it? How do you know it's credible? So again, the data trustworthiness is related to like 4 key components, which is credibility, transferability, dependability, and confirmability. So credibility is that triangulation, you know, to the asking to make sure that the participant that it has that the research has validity, right? So depending on um, asking the study participant and collecting data from different sources. So the researcher is not just doing interviews, they're doing observation, they're doing everything. It's called triangulation. They're using different methods to collect their data. Okay. With the transferability, it generalizes the study findings, right? And it attempts to apply them to other situations and other contexts. So in this case, the researcher cannot prove definitively that the outcome that they arrive is based on the interpretation of data, right? So the interpretation of data can be transferred. They can establish it. They can say, you know what, I have my data, and that if you apply these data to similar population, that will arrive at the same conclusion. And dependability accounts for that change, the reliability of the study. So in many qualitative research, they believe that if credibility have been demonstrated, then it's not necessary to also and separately demonstrate dependability. However, if a researcher um, can actually find, and we're going to discuss how can they make sure that the credibility and that dependability can be shown, can show that their work is credible. They can use different types of, and we're going to talk about that in the next slide, different types of actions to make sure that both that they can show credibility and dependability. And of course, the confirmability can to be it's to authenticate the process, right? And to document that the researcher is objective, that they don't have any bias. So, it can be conducted to replicate earlier work, right? And also to show, because if there's any bias and any that they will start questioning the objectivity of it. And if you notice, I'm using the words objectivity, reliability, internal validity, external validity. We'll discuss that, because that's another way that's for quantitative research. How do you know that the quantitative research is valid? So you did different words um, qualitative is more of trustworthiness, and for quantitative is more of reliability, validity, and objectivity. Okay, so how do you ensure trustworthiness in um, quant- quantitative research? There are different things that the researchers do to make sure, and they put it in their work, so that if anybody else is trying to question their work or maybe trying to replicate their work, they can say, you know what, they did this, they did that, so this researcher, this research must be credible. So they do things like prolonged engagement, where they spend sufficient time in the field to learn and to understand the culture, especially if they're doing ethnography. They will understand the social setting of the phenomenon of interest. They may do referential adequacy. This involves identifying a portion of the data to be archived and not analyzed. And then the researcher will conduct the data analysis on the remaining data and then develop preliminary findings. And then they will go back to the archive data and then analyze it as a way to test the validity of their finding. They may do debriefing, and this one is very helpful in achieving trustworthiness and qualitative research. So in peer debriefing, the researcher will work with more than one colleague in his study. And then those colleagues would now hold uh, uh, impartial view of the study. So any step in the qualitative research should be well briefed to every member of the research, and no one should have concerns regarding the validity of the step. So the members of the research should share their concerns regarding any step, and any problem should be well taken care of before approaching the next step. So in other words, they're checking themselves. And um, so peer debriefing helps the researcher to examine any underemphasized points or any biases or anything that might jeopardize that credibility. They also have prolonged engagement, which is um, spending extended time with the participants in their native culture or in their everyday world to gain better understanding of their behaviors and their values and their social relationships. So it helps the interviewer and other survey researchers to draw out the true observations and conclusions when they're spending time with the participants. So that way they're better able to analyze the situation and understand the meaning in the real life. They may also use negative case analysis. In negative case analysis, they use it to improve the rigor in their research. So it means that the researcher will look for any outliers in the data and then return to the collected data and results to the respondents so they can cross-check. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm talking about the member check, right? So let's go back to negative analysis. So they look for any deviant data and then that does not support what they were looking for, and then they will collect the data, and during their analysis, they will find patterns that show that some part of the hypothesis has been proved wrong. So they use these negative hypotheses to understand the phenomenon. We haven't talked about hypotheses yet because you have the null hypotheses and so we'll talk more about that um, or read more about that or discuss that in our discussions. They do member check where they go back to the participants to see if they can cross-check the data they have to make sure that what they have is what the participants actually said. So it minimizes any confusions, any errors, any misunderstanding, especially if they're recording the interview of the participants. And it helps them also to develop that trust and rapport uh, with their participants. So the next one is detailed, thick description. So in detailed, thick description, the the researcher, this is very important in quantitative, by the way, the researcher will use a good reporting system where he or she will now define a series of types of um, within the research and illustrates these types of data to make sure, like describe it in detail so that anybody reading it can see that they collected the data. and that they were there, and that they were, it wasn't something that maybe flippantly they were, so they would describe um, the, 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 the experience on the interview or what, or their participants in detail. This helps them to convey the uh, rigor to show that they actually did what they're supposed to do. Another thing you might see is random sampling. It's not random sampling in quantitative research doesn't really need to happen, but some researchers would do it just to, make sure to show that their data is credible. Because, what qualitative research involves use of purposive sampling or random sampling, or, they don't need to use that random sampling, but the random sampling will help them to ensure that there's no unknown influences when they're collecting getting the sample. So it could be random, and depending on the nature of the investigation. So again, depending on it, they can, so it's not important, but they use that to show rigor. Some researchers will do reflexive journaling where they will log the details of how uh, he or she may have influenced the results of the interview. And again, that's documented in the research to show that they're not biased or that they were biased, but they keep that reflexive journal for that. They may have audit trails. In audit trails, they have an in-depth approach to illustrating that the findings are based on the participants' narratives and involve describing how they collected and analyzed the data in a transparent manner. Again, it shows that they're not biased or that they're not making up the data. And then triangulation. The triangulation, you will see this again when you do quantitative research. In triangulation, involves the use of different methods. And I think I talked about this earlier, where they use observation, focus groups, interviews to form a major data collection strategy, right? So somebody looking at the data will not say, well, you only use one type of uh, method to collect your data. So you see researchers, they may use focus group and then they do individual interviews, or journaling, so they use different types to make sure that their research is credible. Okay, so these are some of the references. Again, your textbook is a good reference, so please, adhere to it. Okay, thank you. See you in class.